Balfour Luke's Pinot Noir. Ah, that's from. Hang on, Pale. I can't get more than. I don't know who Pale is. But bloody hell. O2 Caviar Von Rom. Okay. Well,
Wow.
that's definitely leaping up a gear. That's leaping up a gear. Wow. That's your Tuesday supper wine. I'd love to know what you're drinking, Saturday night.
Celebratory wine.
We know who you are, DC. We know who you are.
Okay. I know. Okay, great. Oh, Michel Gros as some Clos Real. That was one of the last wines I tasted before leaving Burgundy. Actually, was the Clos Real.
Nice. Pommard. Cote Ormonde. That is a Tuesday wine at yours. I missed that dinner. I was supposed to go to dinner at Phil's, and I unfortunately missed out.
And actually, 2007. What a vintage, Tom! And 2017 is turning into the new 2007. Great perfumed, elegant wines that were underrated at the time and are turning marvelous.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I'd love to know what that 07's like, Phil, because I've got some 05 left and some 03 and 02, and all of them are, I mean, you can easily leave them for a decade. In the case of the 05, probably 2 decades. So yes, some very good kits.
So Karen, we aren't doing a video for everybody just because we've got quite a few people, I think nearly sort of 75, 80. So there was no real way to allow video on this chat. So we had to make it as a webinar. So unfortunately, you've only got the chat function on the side for this one. It's just, otherwise Tom gets too sort of verbose and just carries on talking to other people rather than telling people about Burgundy, which is what we're here for.
And I've got a hell of a lot to say. So yeah.
I hope everyone's popped open a Magnum, because that's how long we're going to be talking for.
Karen, you can be in your onesie if you want.
Absolutely. I'm in mine. Oh no, I'm not in mine. Don't worry.
Don't stand up, whatever you do.
Yeah, exactly. Charlie was saying, no, Tom, you are on camera, so you really do have to, dress appropriately to the occasion. So yeah. Great. Well, I think we were expecting somewhere in the order of 80 plus people. I know we have some people who are going to be drifting in and out. I sort of said, rather like the Archers, you can always have us on in the background and then, replay it later on. But, as usual, we'll try and kind of cover things off in a little over an hour. There is an awful lot to say. And I think as much as I want to tell you things, having just come back from Burgundy, I want to leave this session at least as open for your questions as well. So please use the chat. I don't know if there's a hand raise function or a Q&A on. Oh, there is a Q&A. So yeah, please use the Q&A as well. If you've got specific things you want to ask us, you don't necessarily want everyone else to see. And away we go. You'll have to forgive me ever so slightly. In fact, it's probably a good thing. I've actually taken an awful lot of notes over the last few days whilst I was in Burgundy, and I'm going to be referring to those quite a lot. So, because frankly, I think it's worth having as much useful factual stuff as just the sort of the passion which I would obviously like to bring to the subject. The way I thought I'd structure this is do a brief intro, then look at the growing season. That will lead quite appositely into the effect of climate change, and that will then lead into specific concentration on certain regions, certain producers, and really we'll kind of work our way through whites and nuit reds and bone, etc. And then towards the end, we'll start just beginning to look at the campaign itself, the market, the current market, prices, that sort of thing. It's going to be a very different campaign this year from anything that you'll have seen previously, and that's obviously down to the effect of the pandemic. Normally, we would be gearing up to launch our Burgundy on Primeur campaign end of December, or really sort of in between Christmas and New Year, ready to kickstart things with our series of 2 or 3 or even 4 Burgundy tastings in January. It's very, very unlikely those tastings are going to go ahead, certainly not in the form which you've been used to in the past. However, at the end, we'll have a little discussion about some ideas we've had about how we can engage with you about the vintage, and very much appreciate your feedback on whether, you know, certain ideas are of more interest than others. So let's do Burgundy 19. I think I'll just reiterate my intro notes from the invitation the other day. You know, it's the first thing to say is it's a very good vintage, and it's a very good vintage in a very interesting way because it's very even-handed. You know, when we were out last year, the few 19s we tried, the Hospice de Beaune 19s, Jane Eyre Chambertin 19, a few other bits and pieces in barrel, you know, which was probably pre-mallow, had only been, you know, 2 months ago on the vine. They showed tremendous early promise, but there was this indication that people, growers themselves, were a little less satisfied with the whites. Now, what's definitely, I'd say without a shadow of a doubt, been shown from my tasting, and also you can definitely read a lot of other, well, not a lot of other commentators, because very few people will have tasted in the last few weeks or the last few months, but certainly, you know, Jasper Morris, William Kelly, Neil Martin, there seems to be a broad consensus of opinion amongst the few who've tasted that the reds are very, very, very good indeed, and the whites are very, very, very good indeed, but this comes as a surprise. So I think I can confidently say I can't recall a vintage which was so even-handed in its blessings to both colors, so both white and red. If you like either or both, you know, you're really in for a treat. I suppose let's start with a very broad characterization of the vintage and then dig a bit deeper. What I've suggested, and it's always, you know, the question everyone wants to know is, what is the vintage like? So the first thing to say is, looking through my notes at what all the growers have said, it's quite difficult to draw a broad consensus. You know, there are some vintage when you can say, oh, it's just like 2002, or even it's a bit like 15 with a bit of 16 thrown in, you know, whereas it's quite clear with 2019 that, you know, Etienne de Monti summed it up very well, saying it was a consensual vintage, and as a winemaker you could make the wine that you wanted to make, and that was all really due to when you picked effectively. But trying to make some generalizations, I think we could say that for both reds and whites, there is not the same volume in the wines as 2018, you know, which was a warmer, it was a more warm year for longer than 19, as in, I think William Kelly mentioned it the other day on Instagram, there were 30% more sunlight hours than a typical vintage. Now in 1919, there were 20% more, but there were also sort of spikes. So there were hotter, briefer periods, but overall, it is the second of 3 solar vintages, and we'll talk about what that means in terms of understanding Burgundy more broadly. But there is definitely there's not the same volume in the whites and reds as you find in 18. There is, however, this incredible concentration, this incredible dry extract, this incredible richness and depth. But what I find really attractive about 19 is this is allied, certainly with the best wines and certainly with the growers that we have chosen to work with this year, this is allied with a wonderful freshness, a wonderful focus, and impressive transparency to the terroir. Not perhaps as obviously so as a vintage like 2017, which I personally absolutely love in both white and red, but it's definitely more chiseled than 18. And yet, as I said, it's got this real concentration and richness. You know, the wines enter the mouth, and by and large, they just go on and on and on, and this incredible succulence of sweet fruit just powers through. They're really very exciting wines. Not difficult by and large to taste in their youth. When Clémence and I were tasting our agreement, our notes were broadly in agreement that, you know, there are very few wines where you've got a mouthful of unresolved tannins or a huge amount of oak. And I'm not going to dwell too much on use of new oak and use of whole bunch. You know, this is all stuff you can read, you know, further down the line. But I would say in general, there was probably a tendency to use a little bit less whole bunch in the ferments, and possibly a touch less new oak as well. But even that was depended producer to producer and site to site. But yeah, we're looking at concentration, depth, focus, great freshness and vivacity, and, you know, very, very pleasurable wines indeed, both whites and reds. It's not a homogeneous vintage. You know, it's not a year I would recommend just, you know, put your finger where you like and just get the wine it lands up on. You know, there are some guidelines, but I would say it's probably more to do with style than quality, because by and large there are more, you know, really, really good wines made in 19 than in 16, 17 and 18. You know, I mean, there's just a lot of great wines. And what's really exciting is the quality of the wines across the board. So, you know, I've never drunk as exciting Bourgogne Rouge or some of the lesser well-known appellations. You know, it's a great year for the hidden gems to shine, and we'll come on to that in a bit. So it's always useful to start these things with a brief kind of a précis of the growing season. So I'll just take you through that. Because then you'll see a little bit, well, hopefully a lot, how, of course, it's impacted on the final style of the wines. It was another very mild winter, and very dry, not just warm, but dry. And you know, this ongoing drought is something which is really starting to characterize what we would call sort of the new standard in Burgundy. And what this meant, of course, is there's very little ground reserves of water. Which of course, you know, you might have slight alarm bells, because therefore, you know, there's the potential of hydric stress later on in the growing season. It was then a very warm February, which meant you had a pretty early bud burst. And paradoxically, Jasper has mentioned this both in person, but on a couple of webinars, Jasper Morris, that is, that early budding, and so climate change or global warming causing warmer winters is paradoxically a concern for frost, because if the buds start early, then you're more likely to get frost early in the season. And there were indeed frosts several times, several quite severe ones in April. Chassaing-Montrachet was quite badly hit on the 4th and 5th. Although I'm delighted to say that when we saw Philippe Collin, and I was asking him, so gosh, did you lose 40% of your crop? He said, no, it was about 10 to 15%. So, but Chassaing generally was quite badly hit by frosts. There was a second frost in a week later, and again, it's had the effect of, you know, reducing the overall yield, so that the yields in 19 are not generous. But when growers say, oh, we're 30% down, what they mean is we're 30% down on 2018, where literally there was barely enough space in the cellars to keep all the barrels. So, you know, it's about an average size vintage, maybe a touch under. And that will kind of hopefully become important when we come at the end to talk about potential pricing. So next up, there was a pretty, it wasn't a very warm June, it was quite cool. And this meant that the flowering began a bit later. There was a certain degree of coulieu, so you know, no berries forming. You know, there was the flowers didn't turn into berries, but this is the key thing: a lot of milonde, a lot of milondage. So this is when, you know, you get the very small berries that form without pips, and this automatically can lead to quite concentrated wines. as we'll see later on come the harvest. You know, the old sort of adage is that the harvest is 100 days from flowering, sort of broadly true, because you know, if you look at Roman Topino Merm, started harvesting on the 16th of September, so it was pretty much exactly 100 days after the flowering. There is a good reason why we need to question this orthodoxy, and that's all to do with the heat and the drought that we experience in the summer months, in the end of the growing season. What was good, talking to various growers, is that, you know, it was, you know, when they picked the grapes, and they had to be very careful to pick them at the right time, but when they picked them, the grapes were in perfect physiological health. You know, there was no rot, there was no mildew, you know, it was dry, it was warm, so the grapes were in very, very good condition. But what they found was that although the yields were a little bit lower than average, the key thing is that the berries themselves and the juice in the berries was quite diminished. So it was super concentrated. So, you know, the shortage of rain towards the end of the growing season, the lack of rain at the beginning of the season, the coulure and milondage to either remove a certain portion of the potential fruit or concentrate the berries themselves, have all led, I mean, all these things are kind of tick to ensure incredible, I mean, I would say very unusual concentration of the juice and all the elements of the juice, you know. So, you know, this is what you've got is, I've tentatively kind of called this vintage a supercharged classic, and I'll sort of come on to why I'm calling it that in a little bit. Now, I'm just before I launch on, because we're going to kind of tackle the impact of climate change a bit next, I just want to check if there are any questions or comments that I need to tackle at the moment. Interesting comment there from Mark about Beaujolais, about finding the 19 more elegant and precise than the big boned 18s. Well, I think, Mark, you know, you'll find that writ large further north as well. You know, Beaujolais is becoming, whilst it's, of course, it's its own microcosm, it's becoming very much a part of Burgundy, you know, and increasingly the care and attention and quality of the winemaking being made in Cru Beaujolais, it mirrors that which is being made further north in the Côte Chalonnais and up in the Côte d'Or itself. So it doesn't surprise me at all that you found that. I had my first 2020 Beaujolais a week ago, in fact, and that's a different thing altogether. But yeah, so just moving, or sort of changing tack slightly, but looking at climate change, because this is you know, the elephant in the room, you know, and it's quite interesting what people have to say about it. We are actually intending to host a climate and climat, you know, being the small areas within Burgundy. So a climate change and Burgundy seminar, sort of a summit rather, in January, with an illustrious panel to be confirmed. So do watch this space for more on that. The thing is that 2003 was an aberration for Burgundy, in the sense that it was so much hotter than anything that people could remember. It caught a lot of people by surprise. 2005 was a hot vintage. 2009 was unusually warm and dry as well. But the difference is that they represented unusual vintages for the norm, whereas now everyone is beginning to believe that, you know, from 18 onwards, we're looking at effectively a revised normal, in much the same way that growers are being forced to consider the lower yields that they get are now more standard. They're sort of realizing there's no point saying these are hotter than normal. This is the new sort of standard. And talking to Charles Ballot from Ballot Mio, when I mentioned, you know, how is this affecting you and winemaking generally, he said that winemakers, but also the vines themselves, are adapting. So, you know, winemakers, or a lot of the sensible ones, are increasing, like Charles, they're increasing their kind of canopy cover. So they're giving sun hats to the grapes to prevent them being sort of burned, to protect them from the ravages of the sun. My friend Tom Keble Davies, who runs the Hungry Cyclist Lodge, which we were staying in when we were in Burgundy, he spends a lot of time cycling through the vines. And he says, the challenge is when you're cycling the Route de Grand Cru and you've got these amazing south-facing vines, sort of middle of the slope, there's not a lick of wind in July. You've got the sun like a furnace burning down on them. They need protection. They're very close to the limestone bedrock. These aren't clay-rich soils by and large. They're not pulling up much water. They are in difficulty. So, Charles was saying that the vines themselves, however, are adapting. They're getting used to this level of heat and this level of drought. But to what extent is the question we must ask. Philippe Paquelet suggests, in fact, that the vines are actually adapting to the new circumstances rather more quickly than a number of winemakers. He didn't mention any names, but Philippe is known to march to the beat of his own drum. And I also loved his typically Paquelet comment where he said, for him personally, he much preferred it because he said, we used to have cold, wet summers like in England, and being in the vineyards was shit. I prefer it now. So, classic sort of Paquelet, basically. And fair enough. And I think, Romain Topinot, perhaps a little more restrained, but no less eloquent, said for him, better to have heat and drought at harvest than rain and rot. So I think that's a very, a very important perspective to have. Philippe also talked about the fact that, these hot vintage we've had from 2015 to 20 resemble the post-war years of 1945 to 49, which were full of incredible vintages for Burgundy. The 40s, well, and the 50s, but the 40s had some amazing vintages for Burgundy. And what Philippe loves about it is the fact everything is, there's more of everything. There's more tannins, more acids, more sugars, more aromatics, more everything. So it's not necessarily a bad thing that we've got that people are now more often than not harvesting in very warm, very dry conditions. However, the note of caution comes in from Brian Siev from Domaine de Monty, who referred very much to this window. He says, we have a window to make great Burgundy. And he's concerned that it might be slowly but surely closing. He says, ultimately, we do need more water and we need less sun. For Brian, Brian is a sort of self-confessed acid freak. For him, when he picks is when the pH starts to drop. It doesn't, you want to pick your grapes when they've got good acid. They've got ripe fruit, they've got good acid. But the key thing is, that picking window in these very hot harvest times gets dramatically shortened. So, for Brian, that's simply it. When the acidity and pH reaches a certain level, that's when you pick. And I think more and more producers are following that maxim that you've got to pick on the acid. Because if you wait, and wait, you're going to get unbalanced, overripe, overly tannic, sometimes, properly raisin fruit that lacks freshness. Yeah. So we'll sort of turn on to the whites a little bit. Oh, there are two questions. Sorry, hang on. Good. Thank you, Charlie, for pointing that out. Burgundy seems to be dichotomized between use of whole bunch and destemmers. Yep. Okay, so if you don't mind, I'll definitely come back to that because it'll obviously feature when we move into reds. And there's I wouldn't even say there's two prevailing schools of thoughts. There are those like Philippe Paquelet who, irrespective of the vintage, do 100% whole bunch. There are those like Guillaume Tardy at Domaine Jean Tardy who who destem everything irrespective of vintage. So, but we'll talk a bit about why you might use one or the other, you know, according to the vintage when we move on to the reds. But please remind me, Charlie, that that question's out. I don't want to skip it. It's an important one. And yes, sorry, the other question about from Dom about pandemic discount. Yeah, we'll come on to pricing. We will come on to pricing at the end for sure. But again, this is going to be very important too. Turning to the whites, you know, we actually started our tasting with Philippe Collin. Well, actually, it wasn't Philippe, because Philippe had sensibly buggered off to South Africa. I was noting the other day how it increasingly doesn't surprise me that Northern Hemisphere winemakers have a nice sort of Antipodean, American bolt hole, South American bolt hole to go and make wines and do the harvest when it gets a bit cold and grim in Northern Europe. So Philippe has a really interesting project in Franschhoek, which was where he was. So it was actually Emmanuel, who's the he's number 2, who was hosting us. And you know, one thing that was interesting was that, you know, some of the alcohol levels were up to 13.8%, which, you know, which isn't dramatic, to be honest. And there's no denying the fact that there are sites in Burgundy for whites which can comfortably cope with higher levels of alcohol. You know, there's no reason to imagine that you can't be a white Burgundy and be 13.5%. You can be up to 14 or more. It's so long as the balance is there. And that's the critical thing with 19, that, you know, there were very high levels of tartaric acid. And by refraining from too much batonnage, so lees stirring, you keep the freshness, you keep the vivacity. So Emmanuel was saying that he thinks that the 19s have the same matière, the same intensity and richness of 2014, but with more of the generosity of a warmer vintage, like maybe 15 or 18. But he says it's definitely a grand year. You know, it's definitely a great year for whites. Charles Ballot points to the fact that, you know, some of his whites, you know, have an alcohol level which is approaching the 2003 levels, but they have the acidity of 2017. So, you know, and there's a huge amount of dry extract in Charles's wines, which give this sort of autolytic bitterness, which it reminds me very much of the argument that Richard Geoffroy, the former maître de cave at Dom Pérignon, used to give for the hotter vintages in Champagne. That, you know, this autolytic bitterness from, in the case of the Champagnes, extended lees aging, in the case of these Burgundies, intense dry extract, it actually gives another type of vivacity and balance and freshness to the very rich fruit. So, you know, these are wines with balance for sure. One particular wine I'd commend to you just on the white front was a fascinating tasting we did with Edouard Delaunay, or at Edouard Delaunay with Laurent Delaunay. Wonderful. His Pouligny-Montrachet Refer, one of my favorite vineyards in Pouligny, was absolutely incredible. So that would definitely be a tick for me, and should be a tick for you. Absolutely incredible. Before we move on to reds, I do just want to briefly talk about Chablis, because we tend to forget about Chablis a little bit in our on Primeur campaigns. But Chablis are very good indeed. You know, again, the surprising thing is that despite the heat, despite some of the riper characteristics that you find, they're still very Chablis-esque. You know, they've still got everything you expect in a Chablis. They've still got that vivacity and that kind of very saline character. I mean, Nathan, do you want to say a few words on the Chablis you tried, given that you went through a pretty comprehensive range the other day?
Well, I'm known as the guy who doesn't drink Chablis, so therefore Tom decided I should taste all of the Chablis. And I've got to say, you know, 2019 is a very interesting year for whites, just generally. I'm a very big white Burgundy drinker, and, you know, I'd say more Meursault and Chassagne nowadays, and Saint-Romain, places like that. But I think, Tom, to answer your question, I think 2019 has done really well for Chablis, and the prices are, they're sort of okay, but there's a lot there at Premier Cru level and definitely at Grand Cru level that's really, really very, very appetizing, because the acidity is high, but the matière, the dry matter, the extract, the weight of the wines is very attractive. So even as a determined Chablis loather, I manfully tasted my way through loads of them. I've written up loads of notes, so anybody who wants a choice, and I think Domaine Long d'Eparquis is representing a really good range this year. So yeah, Chablis, I'll just about give it a sort of grudging 7 or 8 out of 10.
That's very kind of you, Nathan. I've seen a question from Roger about, and actually, well, a question from Roger, also a comment from Steve on the chat. I'm doing some impressive multitasking here. Eyes going in all directions. Talking about lesser appellations, Bourgogne village wines. Roger was asking in the Q&A about Saint-Romain and some of the higher vineyards. Again, this is something we'll definitely cover as we go along. If somehow it slips my memory, then someone will jog me. So don't worry, these are all things which are important. Moving on to the reds, and we'll start with Nuits reds, Côte de Nuits reds. I think that there seems to be, again, a reasonable degree of consensus that it's a very good year again for Gevrey-Chambertin. Those sites which have maybe a touch more clay and sort of iron in the soil, not just straight on the limestone, a little bit more water retention basically do well in these hot vineyards, these slightly heavier clay soils. We'll talk about that more when we talk about the Côte de Beaune and Pommard especially. But it was fascinating, talking to we're quite long on Gevrey, frankly. So I had plenty of people to talk to and plenty of wines to try. And just to sort of take you through some of the responses that we got and some of the wines we tried. Pierre Durocher, what an incredibly exciting producer. It's always so exciting to go and taste with him. You just wonder if he can keep on doing it, keep on making these incredible vintages. And 19 is a superb vintage for Pierre. I mean, it's such a Durocher vintage. But he suggested that the vintage is reminiscent of 2017 for its definition, but says it's noticeably more concentrated because he had about 30% less yield than the 2018. I mean, also with Durocher, his wines are characterized by very old vines and quite a lot of milonde berries anyway, milondage berries anyway. So, those old vines have dug deeper into the bedrock and are able to extract the water, but also they're older, they're more resistant to the sun. So, he made some phenomenal wines. And, his Bourgogne Rouge, Steve, to your point about, the Bourgogne Rouge from Durocher is easily the rival of a lot of village Gevrey-Chambertins from lesser producers. In fact, I think that does it down. I'd rather drink his Bourgogne Rouge than the Gevrey-Chambertin from a lot of lesser producers. It's just a stunning wine. Incredible wines there. The Lavard Saint-Jacques, amazing. The Genevois, the Lieu-dit, and we'll come on to Lieu-dits a bit later. But just staggering wines. Pierre was saying that the interesting difference, for example, 19 and 18, is that 19, like 17, shows definitely more of a red fruit character. And then the 15 or the 18, but it has great phenolic maturity and pitch perfect ripeness. So interestingly, last year, Neil Martin wrote that Durocher's style of wine is very much in the mold of Romain Topinot in Moret Saint-Denis. And it's always fascinating talking to Romain. He's one of the most sort of eloquent and honest sort of appraisers of the vintage. And well, make of this what you will, if you could understand what he thinks the vintage is like. He says it's a blend of 2010 and 2015, but without the same energy of the former, or 2016, which it resembles, or the gourmandise sweetness of the latter, and not so precise in terms of definition as 2017, although it will gain precision. So yeah, I'm not quite sure. I'm still trying to work out exactly where that leaves me, but you know, he said it in a very enthusiastic way, so I'm pretty sure that means it's good. Charles Magnan. Now, Charles, that was an incredible visit, I have to say. He does make a very gourmand style, and I think more so than Romain, more so than Pierre. But still, the wines were 12.7 to 13.6%. And he says, perhaps more succinctly, that, you know, they're more classic than 2018, the 19s, with better acidity and more fresh Pinot character, and each terroir is in the glass. And I think that's a very nice summation for the best of 2019. And a couple of wines to look out from Charles. He has a wonderful strip of Castier, just next to Clos Saint-Jacques. And it's known as the baby Chambertin because the 4 soil types there are in exactly the same combination as in Chambertin. That's absolutely tremendous Premier Cru, although personally I thought his Lavar Saint-Jacques this year was outstanding. However, this is one for you, Steve. The real form horse is his Champérier, which is his, you know, in blind tastings, tastes like a Premier Cru. This is a fantastic Lieu-dit Gevrey, and it was absolutely knockout. You know, really was knockout. So yeah, I think great year for Gevrey. And I couldn't leave Gevrey without saying a brief mention of one of my favorite wines of the vintage, which was Jane Eyre's Premier Cru Corbeau, her Gevrey Corbeau. I've loved this. I've loved this wine ever since she's got the contract. 18 was phenomenal. 19 is even better. It's from a plot right next to Mazy Chambertin Grand Cru. And it was absolutely knockout. It was just gorgeous. It was very Jane, so very supple, very perfumed fruit, but very focused, very driven, just absolutely stunning. So the only big disappointment for me, I mean, it was a big disappointment, I can't deny it, was that due to the pandemic restrictions, Dugapi had shut their doors for the season, and they just weren't open for business. So you know, that was unquestionably the highlight of the tasting last year was Dugapi. Were incredible, the 18s. But I am prepared to stick my neck out and say that if Loic hasn't knocked it out of the park with 19, then I mean, I'll eat more than just my hat, put it that way. I'll eat the whole hat stand. You know, I have no doubt when we get around to tasting those, they'll be incredible. Then various other bits and pieces on Nuit. I think that yeah, we had a lovely tasting at Bichot. And an interesting wine to look out for there is the Fissa Claude Le Perrier Premier Cru, which again, if you want to look up your sort of hidden vintages, hidden gems, we're doing a whole series, a whole video series we did with the growers on hidden gems sort of under the radar in Burgundy and key vineyards to look out for. And you know, Claude Le Perrier was back in the original, well, one of the earlier 18 classifications of Burgundy, Jules Laval in 1855. This Premier Cru vineyard in Fissa was in the Tête de Cuvée, was considered amongst the Grand Crus. And I think it's not there yet, but it's well on the way. So that was an absolute cracker. And yeah, for Bichot, you know, particularly for Clos Frantin, the sort of the jewel in the crown, I think it's their best year since 2015. You know, the Vaunes from the village Vaune, which I took in 15 in Magnums as a great dinner party drink. I will do so again for sure in 19. You know, right the way through to their Echezeaux Grand Cru, which was fabulous. And then in between, you know, you have the Malconsour Premier Cru, which is the famous vineyard where, you know, you've got Domaine Romani Conti's La Tâche at £3,000 a bottle. You take a step, literally a step, and then you are right next to De Monty's Malconsour Au Christian, which is about £250 a bottle. You take another step or two, and you're right next to the Malconsour patches that are owned by Domaine de Clos Frantin, and that's £100 a bottle. So it's incredible how, you know, in the space of 10, 15 meters, you know, you go from £3,000 a bottle to £100 a bottle. But certainly, Vosne for me is you know, it's more red fruit, it's more nervous, it's more silky than Gevrey. There's some cracking Vosne Romanés out there. The one wine I would particularly draw to your attention from Domaine de Clos-Frantin is a brand new Premier Cru, as in they basically bought it from a estate they also owned, and it's now under the Clos-Frantin banner, and that is Les Rouges. So it's a Premier Cru which sits just above Echezeaux, and price-wise, it's sort of in between the Village and the Malconsor. That I think is a really, really good wine to look out for. Then where have we got to? So probably the most interesting tasting that we did was with Laurent Delaunay from Edouard Delaunay, and it was interesting because we tried 28 wines going from Bourgogne à Légoté, which I'm drinking now, you know, right the way up to Echezeaux and Clos Vougeot, and we crisscrossed across the Côte de Beaune and the Côte de Nuits, and you know, with very, very few exceptions, the wines were sensational. You know, really amazingly of their terroir. Laurent has done an incredible job in an insanely short space of time. You know, they only relaunched in 2017. He's now got the most amazing contracts, these amazing parcels, just sort of hand-picked choice plots across the Côte de Nuits and Côte de Beaune, and they were absolutely fabulous. In fact, yeah, one of the main strengths for him is Nuits Saint-Georges, and Nuits Saint-Georges is another region. I think, wow, the appellation is just coming up and up and up, and from producer to producer, whether it was Paquelet's Nuits Saint-Georges Chéniaux, whether it was the Creux or Merger from Delaunay, whether it was Jean Tardy, whether it was Guillaume's Argia, or my favorite, the Bad Combe, the little hidden vineyard below Boudot. You know, Nuits Saint-Georges, you've got to get at least one case of Nuits Saint-Georges in your cellar from 19. You won't regret it. They're setting a new standard for sure. And the wine that I particularly point out from Delaunay, which I think is such an oddity, it's such a great one, it's a real dinner party talking point, and I took some last year, is his Petit Vougeot. So this is the little tiny Premier Cru, which, you know, on the west is Musigny, on the north is Amoureuse, and on the south is Clos Vougeot. So I mean, you've got this incredible, you know, Grand Cru neighborhood around it, and it's just delicious. It's really, really good. And that's the sort of thing which, you know, you're probably talking, I hope, somewhere in the region of £360 a case of 6, that sort of thing in Bonn. So, you know, it's where it should be, but a lot more money. Sorry, a lot more money. The other way around, a lot more wine for the money, I should say. Okay. And then, you know, one of the things that I guess we'll cover slightly towards the end is, you know, Delaunay is based out in the Haute Côte, and I mean, he's a massive champion of the potential of the Haute Côte, you know, and with good reason. So, you know, these more northerly vineyards, these much weaker soils, they're often in slightly shadier places. They're obviously much cooler at night, this diurnal temperature difference. This all plays very, very well with global warming. So, you know, another cracking value wine would be Guillaume Tardy's Haute Côte de Nuits. His Haute Côte de Nuits red is absolutely delicious, and it's from a site which is just very, very. It's the nearest to Vosne Romanée. I can't remember the name of the lieu dit. Someone will find it, but anyway, that Tardy's Haute Côte de Nuits, absolutely delicious. And then finally, before we move on to Beaune Reds, it's worth mentioning Benoit Starley at Domaine Georges Lignier in Moray-Saint-Denis. Cuvée Meili, thank you, Nathan. Yeah, thanks. Oh, brilliant. Sorry, Theresa's just come in with a top up. I was getting a little parched. Talking about Burgundy.
Okay, Tom, I'm always the master of lieu dit.
talking about Burgundy with an empty glass is a terrible thing. So the only thing worse, of course, is having to listen to it with an empty glass. So yeah, very interesting tasting with Georges at Georges Lignier with Benoit. We didn't go with Georges Lignier last year. We found, I don't know, Nathan and I just found the wines didn't quite express the vintage as it might, you know. I think when you're given a vintage like 18, an utterly full throttle, go for it vintage, that's what you do. And we didn't feel that Benoit had, but the 19s, I have to say, were really lovely, very charming. And you know, Benoit suggested, I think quite rightly, that, you know, he said for him it was the vintage of a lifetime, vintage of his lifetime. You know, he said that it harmonized the power of the 2012, 2015 and 18 with the elegance and definition of 14 and 17. And certainly one of my absolute bargain wines, I've tried to get it most years, is the Maurice and Denis Clos des Ormes, which he makes. So Clos des Ormes is this wonderful vineyard where you've got La Trissier Chambertin on the left, and then above it Clos de la Roche. And it costs virtually nothing. It's embarrassing, and it's really, really good. So that's another little secret hidden gem to point out. And finally, in the Nuit, on the subject of Premier Cru Maurice, I couldn't go without talking about my one wine I never, ever, ever failed to get, which is the Maurice and Denis Premier Cru Riot from Roman Topino. That is, for me, a must buy wine. So on to Beaune Red. This will be much quicker, for no other reason than I know you'll get bored. So you know, Beaune itself is on great form. Jane Eyre's Sans Vin was delicious. Dumonte's Beaune Grève, fantastic. And then on the white front, you know, the Beaune Aigreau, and also Bichot's wonderful Clos de la Mouche, which, you know, we probably know better from Juin, but Bichot have the bit above, slightly higher up the slope, so it's a slightly more elegant, finessed, less opulent style, but a bit more aromatic. You know, Beaune is just really on the march at the moment. Again, those heavier, maybe slightly more iron-rich soils, more clay. They hold the water, they're getting more sun. You know, the wines are becoming a lot more sophisticated, you know, a lot more genuinely and generally exciting. And then Pommard. You know, Pommard is stunning in 19. You know, gone are the days where Pommard was the sort of slightly rustic, grip beneath the fingertails, you know, younger brother or even older brother of Volnay. You know, that this, again, this water retention, this warmer weather, you're getting much more sophisticated tannins, much more kind of supple fruit. You know, they're absolutely cracking. And, you know, from de Monty, whether you have the Lieu-dit L'Écrat, or whether you have the Pommard Pézerolles, I mean, the Pézerolles is incredible this year. Absolutely, I mean, absolutely stonking. One particular vineyard which really caught my attention this year was the Chaponie Vineyard. And I tried 3 examples. I don't know if we'll necessarily buy them all, but Delaunay did a beautiful Chaponie. It's quite a high up vineyard. But Philippe Paquelet, for the only time, so this is a proper unicorn wine, he split his Pommard Premier Cru into the 2 vineyards, Epinot and Chaponie. And I much preferred the Chaponie. Next year, he's going to blend them back together. So this will be the only year you can buy, you know, a single Premier Cru Pommard from Paquelet. And that Chaponie was absolutely stonking. So I hope we get a reasonable allocation of that. Yes. And then, of course, you know, Corton. I never thought for a million years, well, okay, I never thought for a decade or so I'd be falling in love with Corton. But I mean, you know, Corton is now a proper Grand Cru. You know, it tends to be one of the first to be picked, as it certainly was for Roman Topino. He started picking his Corton Rognier on the 16th of September, had to stop for a bit, then carry on. But you know, it's a beauty. It's a big wine, but it's a beauty. On the other end of the scale, Jane Eyre's Corton, which is a blend of Corton Brezande and Corton Renard, giving at once structure and perfume. is absolutely delicious, and a much prettier Corton. So, you know, you've got Romance on the one end, which is 14%, and it's big but beautifully balanced. Jane's, which is kind of perfumed and very, very steely. And then in the middle, De Monte's fabulous Clos de Roi. You know, I mean, just delicious. They're all brilliant expressions of Corton. And frankly, if I could afford all of them, then I'd have a case of each. You know, but it's definitely, Corton is looking really, really exciting. Then with regards to the kind of the less well-known appellations, I mean, Fissin, you know, Fissin, wonderful wines coming out of Fissin now, and Marcenay too. So, you know, in the northern end of the Côte de Nuit, this is where really we're heading up towards Dijon quite rapidly. Some really lovely wines there. Also found cracking wines from La Doire. So here, this is the north of the Côte de Burgundy. You know, if you haven't got into Philippe Paquelet's wines yet, then a brilliant place to start would be his Village La Doire, or even better, the Premier Cru. I mean, they were just brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And then Santenay. I think Santenay is really getting exciting. Laurent Delaunay had a brilliant one. You know, there's some great wine being made there now. It's probably it's the most Santenay Premier Cru is the most affordable Premier Cru in the Côte d'Or. You know, and it's a Premier Cru, it's a proper Premier Cru, and it's affordable. So I'd look out for that as well. And then, as I mentioned earlier, just the Bourgogne level. The Bourgogne Noirs are just fabulous. I mean, really, really good. You know, if that's as far as you want to go in Burgundy, you won't disgrace yourself or guests by serving some of the Bourgogne Noirs from 19. They're proper wines. With regards now to some of your questions and weaving into that, because I think now is the time to do that. Certainly, Roger, you mentioned Saint-Romain. So yeah, one thing one had to be a little bit careful of in 19 is that actually, because of the heat, these very high sites, sorry, because of the drought, rather, because of the lack of water, these very, very high sites on very, very poor soil, which is normally great, very, very mineral, very nervous, you know, they might have suffered a little bit more than those further towards the middle because of the simple lack of water. But what you definitely find in these hotter vintages, it's not just the sites which are right up on the top of the hill. It's also the ones which are a bit lower down as well, funnily enough. You're starting to get interesting wines pushing away from that lovely kind of central belly around the Côte d'Or. So both, you know, further up and further down, there's interesting things to be found. There was a comment, a question rather, about destemming and whole bunch. So yeah, I to be honest, there are different schools of thought. Everything from, as I said, 100% destem to 100% whole bunch, to increasingly people experimenting, you know, somewhere in the middle, vintage dependent. You know, people who are not dogmatic, they do what they think is best according to the site in that particular vintage. The benefits of whole bunch are that you get more non-juice, so more non-alcohol, more non-fruit into the vats, which I think on average, you know, whole bunch will give you an extra, will diminish alcohol level by up to ½ degree, you know, and that's a good thing. And it will also give a little bit more kind of, I mean, in 18, I think whole bunch was very important because you had so much fruit, you needed more than just fruit. But that having been said, you'll get a producer like Guillaume Tardy, who never does whole bunch at all. And he says he much prefers to get his complexity from the skins. So he will do a very long, very cool maceration, and he feels that he gets the tannins and the extra kind of matter in the wine from the skins rather than from the stalks. Then you get interesting sort of people in the middle, like Jane Eyre, for example. So with her Charme Chambertin, which I should have mentioned earlier, but we've only got a case left. This was the barrel which we crowdfunded for her this year. And it again, trying it again last week, it's absolutely phenomenal. But here's an interesting example where she does a degree of whole bunch, but she will actually cut the sort of the green center out of the stalk. So it's whole bunch, but you lose some of the actual stalk. You know, so I don't want to dwell too much longer on that, because literally for every winemaker you talk to, they'll have an entirely different philosophy. But you know, I think the key thing is that whole bunch is becoming increasingly not only accepted but common, with producers are experimenting with it, and it certainly helps balance the wines, and it's definitely something that to be considered. Yes, Raquier, I've just seen a comment there. So and Mercury, so that was a fabulous visit. So you know, another obvious place to turn as prices go up and the temperature goes up is further south to the Chardonnay, because you know, everyone in Burgundy this year in 2020 was going, oh God, you know, we were picking in August. You know, Raquier has been picking in August for the last 7 vintages, you know, or 6 vintages at least. So you know, they are very comfortable. They're very comfortable with the extra heat and the dryness. In fact, for them, you know, for Francois, he said, you know, we're making better and better wines. This extra heat, the lack of concern about picking in damp means that they're getting much better quality fruit. They're getting a smaller yield. So, you know, again, that's pushing the quality up, and they're ultimately making better wines. So, you know, we're going to take a lot of those Raquier wines, white and red. I thought they were stunning, tremendous value, old vine fruit. Absolutely, fill your boots, Mark. I mean, they were just spot on for sure. So I was going to turn now to more the market and prices and the campaign, and that can obviously bring in Dom's earlier question about about pricing and stuff. I'm just checking, are there any other comments I might have missed on chat to mention at this point? Looks like I'm doing okay. It's a smaller harvest than 18. It's a slightly smaller harvest than average, and it's a very, very good vintage. And the Burgundians have, you know, had a spate of very undersized years right up until 18. You know, 14, 15, 16, 17 were all small. And 2020 is going to be small as well, because here, you know, you really had proper drought, and the selection, well, what was, you know, there was very limited production. So, you know, these are all the arguments for why the Burgundians will want to push the prices up. On the negative side, or I should say the positive side, from our perspective as merchants and wine drinkers, there is a recognition of the global situation. There is a concern about the market. You've got to remember, a lot of Burgundy growers sell you know, a pretty impressive amount of their wine direct into restaurants, direct into private clients where they can in France. So, yeah, well, private clients are still there, but the restaurants obviously aren't. So what we are beginning to see, and I'd say it's too early to be definitive, but I do think the prices are going to hold by and large. That there will be a few increases, but I'm afraid one thing we're not going to see is a dramatic, you know, Bordeaux style drop, Dom, to your point in the Q&A. Burgundy doesn't need to do that. The production is a tenth, is 100th of Bordeaux. You know, they're not going to do that. You know, there are people who will buy these wines, not least because, you know, with a smaller year, if you don't, you know, it's not like Bordeaux. If you don't buy it now, you know, buy now or buy later for less, you know, in certain en primeur vintages. Luckily, I'm glad to say, certainly not the 19. You know, Burgundy, it's not going to be that way. These wines are going to go. It's an amazing vintage. There's not a lot of it. And I don't think the Burgundians are not going to drop their prices, I'm afraid. That having been said, in every other respect, you would expect them to put them up. But I'm hoping what we've seen so far is that there should be a degree of level pegging and a few small increases. One thing, of course, we can't account for is what terrible state sterling will be in the next few weeks, with everything, all the fun and games with Brexit. And of course, that makes a huge difference. Ultimately, the currency gain or loss when it comes to pricing Burgundy.
Tom, should I comment on that?
Yeah, sure.
So the prices we've seen so far are between a couple of percent down and about 5% up on last year in euros, but the pound is down about 4% compared with last year. But we obviously have the conclusion of the Brexit negotiations, and whether things go well or badly. As Tom said, it's an excellent year with low production, and the Burgundians just don't behave in the same way as the Bordelais. In Bordeaux, there's a lot more wine, and the distribution channel is a lot more of a cartel. Whereas in Burgundy, we're dealing with something like 17 individual producers. So everyone who is sending us anything with even €0.50 price increase is getting a big kick on the shins from us. But that doesn't necessarily make any difference. So if you're budgeting this year, assume about a 5% increase in pounds, but hope that you can get away with it. The other big thing I'd say, Tom, as Burgundy collector myself, is you can actually trade down a bit. Given that the Lieu D and the Village wines are so good this year, if you want to save a bit of budget, you could always go down a bit from Premier Cru or something. But it's unfortunately, whereas we saw 17 to 30% discounts or price decreases this year on Bordeaux, I just don't see that happening on Burgundy at the moment. I wish it was, because I'm a big collector myself, but that's as we see it at the moment.
Absolutely, and a couple of comments about other specific appellations. So yes, there were a couple of interesting Savignys. Jane did make a Savigny this year, and I have to say I rather liked it. So we will probably be offering. Well, we'll certainly offer it if you want it. We'll probably get some cases. Generally, it was really nice. Savigny had a good year this year, I have to say, more so than last year. Interesting Savignys from Delaunay, from Jane, a couple of other producers. There's some good kit there. Dare I even say it, I even tried like an Alos Corton that I quite like. So that just shows how good the vintage is, frankly. I think that now, if I may, just checking, here we go. Yeah, so as Steve has helpfully mentioned it here on the chat, tasting, how and are you going to be able to taste these wines? So the simple answer is, as I mentioned at the beginning, Burgundy Week is not going to happen as we know it. There aren't going to be a whole load of tastings happening around London in big halls where you get to try 100 or so wines. I'm afraid it's not going to happen. So what is going to happen, or what are we going to do? So one idea that we had is I've kind of drawn up what I call a Burgundy Matrix. And this is taking quite a lot of the wines, the key wines I've sort of targeted and mentioned as I've been talking. We're going to take what I think are sort of benchmark wines from our key growers. That what we would like to do is, using the technology which we've sort of pioneered alongside 67, vis-a-vis the putting into smaller units, 50 cl. ml, 50 cl ml, 50 mil, 50 cl would be great, but yeah, pointless. So 50 mil vials, our little tubes, and the idea would be to offer people a range of the kind of key wines, the key Lieu Ds, the key Premier Crus, as being very representative of the vintage. Obviously, these would not be the 19s because we cannot get these samples over. They won't do it. And it wouldn't make much sense to anyway, to take unstable barrel samples and then try and put them into vials. It just won't work. So what we're doing is we're asking our growers to, in conjunction with us, to come up with a representative vintage of the year, which we will then put into 50 ml samples and then send to you. But what we'll do with that is, as part of the matrix, we'll say, if you like this wine but would like to spend a bit less, then go for this Lieu D under the Premier Cru. If you, however, you like this wine but would like to spend a bit more, then go for this more senior Premier Cru or this Grand Cru. And similarly, if you like this Lieu D but want to spend more, go to the Premier Cru. If you like this Lieu D but want to spend less, go for the Village or the Bourgogne. it's not going to be perfect, but I do think we'll give you a very good cross section of some of the highlights of the year. You all have your favorites anyway. And if you are new to this, I think this is as good a way as any of experiencing Burgundy and frankly, getting a better sense of where these wines might end up than having to try the raw barrel samples. There was a lot of indication this year from critics that the wines tasted in January this year, the Burgundy tastings, weren't tasting as good as they were either in November beforehand or a little bit later when people were retasting in March. So, tasting barrel samples is always a bit perilous unless you do it all the time like we do as professionals. And I'm not being patronizing, but I think sometimes it's possibly more useful to try a wine which more clearly resembles where the wine you're about to purchase is likely to end up than to try the raw barrel sample itself. So this is our idea. Nothing's been finalized, but we'd be very interested, really interested in your feedback. Is that something that you'd be interested in being part of? If you've got better ideas or ways to refine it, please let us know. I think, alongside that, we will host some grower tastings, some master classes, with again key growers, with some key wines. We want to engage you as much as possible with the process in the more limited fashion that we will be allowed to do under the current and likely restrictions moving forward. Alongside that, as I mentioned, we've got quite a lot of great video footage with growers, just small 2-3 minute clips about, the vintage, about key wines. And I hope that will give you a bit more confidence as well in making your choices. With regards to how to approach the campaign, as ever, it's good not to do it piecemeal. It's good to set yourself a budget, set yourself an idea of what you want to spend or what you're looking for. Do I want to buy 2 or 3 cases of red, 2 or 3 cases of white? Do I want to spend £1,000, £2,000, £100,000? And then we can start to direct you, according to your tastes, to your preferences, and to our sort of highlights from the year. The other thing to mention, which is quite important, is because we won't be, doing these big tastings in January as we normally do. We don't see any reason not to launch the campaign earlier this year. We are getting the prices in. Frankly, we're going to start the campaign probably as early as next week, and we won't be alone in doing that. I think the plan is we would like to kickstart with one of our big names with a lot of wines, which is Domaine de Monti, who has made some stunning wines across the board from top to bottom and left to right. And the idea is that you can start getting involved with Burgundy even before Christmas. We'll have a number of growers up and ready to go before the new year, and then things will continue as usual through January and early Feb. But it's going to be an early campaign this year, and we'd encourage you to get involved as soon as we press the button.
Tom, should I explain how that'll work for people?
Yeah, sure.
So you're used to seeing us doing a tasting right at the beginning of January and having a catalogue then. How we'll be doing it this year is the same, that there will be the catalogue and the offer in January. But in the run up to January, given that we already have some of the wines available, we'll basically be releasing them grower by grower with a wish list. And so it's first come, first served on some of the top stuff there. As Tom said, we're expecting to introduce the wines, the amazing, fantastic wines this year, again from Domaine de Monti sometime next week.
Yeah.
But if you want to do it as your, like I do it myself, is I like to have a look across the range and think, what am I going to be getting? We should have the entire wish list roughly done next week as well. So you'll be able to go through and tick off, and whichever of the team you're dealing with, you'll be able to say, yeah, subject to the prices, I'd probably like this in my portfolio this year.
Yeah. So there we go. The bombshell has been dropped. We're going to be tapping you up for Burgundy before the new year So there you go. It's part of your Christmas wish list to yourself and to friends. You know.
Tom, can I put you on the spot and ask you a question? Okay.
Go on then.
So, you know, you've been around Last Week Tasting. We've tasted loads of 18s, 19s. We've seen the way things are evolving. But one of the things quite a few people ask me is, you know, I'm really after the big names. Why do you have people who are, why are you offering me these names, a mixture? We have a mixture of people who are extremely, very, very well-known names, but also people who are less known. Why do, you know, I know my own answer for it, okay? So I'll answer after you've had a go, but why do you think that people should look at some of the lesser known producers that we support, the Jane Eyres, the Philippe Collins and so on?
Yeah, I think the very simple answer is that they are making wines which are every bit as good as better known and, more importantly, more expensive growers. You know, the problem is that so much great Burgundy has really, you know, gone beyond the price point that the vast majority of wine lovers can afford. But that doesn't mean that the wines are so much dramatically better. There was that interesting, you know, Eric Asimov article that we responded to, pointing out that, you know, Musigny has gone up by 17 times in price since the 93 vintage. Is it 17 times better than it was in 93? Of course it's not. You know, and there's absolutely no denying that in the current climate, and I mean the global climate, not economic climate, but of that to an extent, but the actual climate, the major beneficiaries have been the slightly under the radar, you know, the sort of the eastern facing escarpments, which didn't get as much sun, but now get every bit as much as they need. Mm-hmm. And on top of that, there's also absolutely no denying that the new wave of producers, whether it's the new generation of the old guard like Loic Dugat, whether it's people like Jane, you know, who are newer on the scene, they're just making incredible wines, and they're better able to respond to the current conditions. They're not, you know, they're not hidebound by tradition, you know. So I think they are the ones who are benefiting from embracing the new modernity, and therefore it behoves us to bring them to your attention.
I mean, my own answer would be, you know, look, I've been collecting Burgundy for nearly, you know, more than 25 years now. And clearly there were big names, some of which we have access to, some of which we don't have. Honest Grapes is a 6-year-old business. But basically, the thing I've learned working with Tom is follow Tom's nose. And so just as, exactly, yeah, you know, just as San Leonardo in Trentino, if we're talking about Italian wines, some of these Burgundy producers, you know, basically I'm somebody who's after value for money, not just a posh name on the label. So the posh name on the label, some of those big labels we have, some we don't. But the wines that we're off, the wines that Tom has scouted out and the people we're working with, I think are just outstanding, and in most cases offer better value for money. And the big news, and the thing that Tom has said, is that just because I think Phil was asking who's the next Roumier, the point is, I'm not saying Roumier is bad at all, far from it. But just because your name is Roumier doesn't mean it works in 2020. Old vines, new winemaking techniques, and people who can cope with climate change, and that's the big thing here.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And you know, it's interesting that you've got, we always look for the next big thing, and you know, I think someone else pointed out, I'm sorry, was it Mark or someone pointed out that, you know, yeah, you know, Jane Eyre got her 2nd star from the Revue de Vin de France, which is, you know, like the Michelin guide for wineries. So, you know, they are becoming noticed. You know, these are the stars of tomorrow. These are what I'd like to call it, these are the future icons, basically. So, you know, get in now. Why wouldn't you? They're great price, wonderful wines, wonderful people, and you know, yeah, there we go. The price quality ratio. It's what we're all about. Brilliant. Any more comments or questions? Anything I failed to cover from? If anyone feels I didn't answer their questions or comments.
I think Roger asked climate change benefiting higher vineyards like Saint-Romain. It's actually quite complex because Roger, higher vineyards should benefit from better aromatics with better diurnal variation. So the bigger the temperature gap between the night and the daytime, the better the aromatics. But actually ultraviolet hitting the thin skin of Pinot in particular affects Pinot more than it does Chardonnay. And so climate change, to be honest, it just depends where you are. We've had some pretty bad Saint-Romain, particularly in 2018, where they were too hot and too alcoholic, and we didn't include them. And the same with, not the same reason, but the same with Savigny last year, which is why we avoided Savigny last year, but we'll feature it more heavily this year.
Any more before we call it a night? Did you see Steve's comment, Nathan? You're drinking your DRC, Leroy, and Catillard weekends. Yep.
Yes, it's the profit on all the wine you buy from us, Steve.
Yeah.
and fills me with my DRC allocation each year. Thank you very much. But yeah, but quite seriously, I mean, there's a good example. You know, we don't do DRC. We're not the agent for that in the UK, but we do have the UK's largest allocations of Domaine Primeur Rock, which is vineyards originally from DRC, and Pacolay, who did his first winemaking at Domaine Primeur Rock. So, and you know, we think they're the exciting people now.
And Pacolay, who was the winemaker at Primeur Rock before starting his own thing. So it all sort of, you know, it all travels. And
David is asking, why does Nathan not like Chablis? I think there are great wines from Chablis and long lived. Fine, David, but I'm a hater, and I have to have something to hate. No, I mean the honest answer is I prefer my Chardonnay on the white stone fruit and Melanie side. Yeah, I like the Southern Burgundy expression of it rather than green apples. That's just me. You know, I hate Salon. I love Philippe Honard. You know, there you are.
And Karen,
the reference there is Chardonnay, green apple Chardonnay, non-malolactic based champagne versus Pinot Noir based champagne.
And Karen, if you're still there, you are. Just to say yes, I didn't think you'd be all that comfortable with the 100 or even 50 ml vials. So what we could do is you could send you a bottle's worth in the vials, you know. But otherwise, yeah. Let's see how we do with the full bottles. Certainly, yes, we do know your tastes. You're going to love your normal Chassagne Montrachet Premier Cruise. You're going to love them as much this year as you ever have. Trust me. So we'll make sure that those are properly sorted out for you. Just checking any last thing. There we go. Good. Well, I think if that is everything, then we'll draw things to a close. It's been great to have you all here. Thank you very much for your comments and your questions. This session is being recorded, so and there were a few people who couldn't make it who were quite keen. We'll be sending that on. As I said, watch out next week for the launch of Burgundy 19. We will also be doing, you know, our kind of, you know, under the radar hidden gems of Burgundy, special sort of focus as well, variously. But I would say in summation, it's another fabulous vintage. But this is a fabulous vintage. I think everyone will like, and will like both colors. So, you know, fill your boots. Thanks very much.
Good evening, everybody.